He found SWAT gear to get through the zombie crowd. Hello all. This is Jacobson and this is a brief retelling of the 9th, 10th and 11th episodes of the 4th season of the zombie series The Walking Dead. You can see the previous episodes at the links in the video description.
In a ruined prison, walkers surround a damaged tank. Then they show the corpse of the governor and the gnawed corpse of Flame, and Michonne is behind the fences. She uses her katana to kill the approaching walkers, and takes cover behind the spikes of the gate. She then uses her old disguise technique and uses 2 trapped walkers as protection by tying them up with ropes and cutting off their jaws and arms. As she walks, she finds Herschel's zombified head and hits it with her katana, leaving the prison shaken. Carl and Rick walk along a country road, with Carl walking ahead of Rick, who has difficulty keeping up with him due to injuries sustained in the previous battle. First they stop at a barbecue restaurant, which seems to have already been looted. A lone walker is barricaded with several pieces of furniture. Rick wants to take him down with his axe, saving their ammo, but is too weak to deliver a killing blow, and Carl shoots him in the head, despite Rick's persuasions not to do so. On the floor, Carl notices a note left by the son of a walker who couldn't bring himself to kill his father. They search the buildings for supplies and finds a small cargo. Carl was able to get more things and jokingly tells his father, "I won." Michonne and her walking pets are walking along the same road that Rick and Carl were walking, and she notices footprints in the mud. However, not knowing their owners, she decides to continue the journey alone. Rick and Carl keep walking until they take shelter in an abandoned house. After the investigation, Carl knocks loudly and swears to lure out the walkers, but Rick is angry at him for this. Carl snaps that he is not a child, and continues to clean the upper floor alone. He lingers in the children's room, looks longingly at the sports posters and the game system, and then pulls the cable out of the TV to secure the front door. Fixing the door, they argue about whether the knot is enough or whether the sofa needs to be pressed against the door. Carl angrily declares that his knot is good and gives Rick a verbal slap in the face, mentioning that Shane taught him this. Rick tells him that he remembers Shane every day and asks if Carl has anything else to say. Carl doesn't answer, and they push the sofa towards the door and turn it on its side. Rick goes to the bathroom at home and examines the bruises and scars on his body, one of which is a knife wound received from Morgan. In an apparent flashback, Michonne, her young son, boyfriend Mike and his best friend Terry are sitting at home and discussing the movie. It starts out as a normal conversation in Atlanta before the apocalypse, but as it continues, Michonne begins to understand the situation she is in. As she talks to Mike and Terry, the conversation turns into a conversation about survival in the camp they lived in. The world outside is gradually turning into a ruined Atlanta, and the condition of the room is becoming more dilapidated. They continue to talk, and then Michonne sees Mike and Terry with their hands cut off, and her son is missing. She starts screaming in terror, and then wakes up from a nightmare in a panic attack in the front seat of the car. In the house, Rick fell unconscious due to his injuries. Carl tries to wake him up, but to no avail. In frustration, Carl starts screaming, which alarms the 2 walkers outside. He lures the walkers away from the front door to kill them somewhere away from the house, but he is cornered by a 3rd walker coming up from behind. However, after a frenzied shooting, he manages to kill all 3 walkers unharmed, repeating his comment to Rick, "I won." Michonne continues walking through the woods. She is struck by the sight of a particular female walker, as she physically resembles her. Michonne shrugs, continues walking with the herd. When Carl returns from a supply trip, the sight of his unconscious father infuriates him. He condemns Rick for allegedly failing to protect a group of prisoners, and then blames him for what happened to Lori and Judith. Carl states that he never forgot how to survive, even when Rick wanted to play farmer. When his father doesn't answer, Carl says he doesn't need him anymore and he wouldn't care if he died. Carl goes on another trip for supplies to the neighboring house. At the top, he opens the door, behind which there is a walker. After a struggle in which he hit a walker with a pistol, he is almost bitten on the leg, but he manages to free himself when the walker pulls off one shoe from his foot. Carl closes the door, locking the walker in the room. He finds a piece of chalk and writes walking inside, "Took my shoes, didn't get me." Sitting on the roof of the house, he begins to eat a huge jar of chocolate pudding, and the walker leaned out of the window. As Michonne continues walking with the herd of walkers, she looks back at the walker who looks like her. It's as if an image of herself appears in front of her, like an animated corpse. In a fit of desperation, Michonne furiously slaughters the entire herd, including her doppelganger and pets. She returns to the road and begins to follow in the footsteps of Rick and Carl. Carl returns to the house, where Rick is still unconscious. Rick begins to move and moan, making Carl believe that he has turned. He grabs Rick's gun, but sobbing, he can't bring himself to shoot, declaring that he needs it. Rick falls to the floor and reaches for Carl's leg. Realizing that he doesn't want to be alone, Carla opens herself up to the seemingly zombified Rick. However, to Carl's great relief, Rika manages to shout out his name. Carl hugs his father's head and says, "I'm scared." Michonne gets to the barbecue hut that Rick and Carl found earlier. She finds the note Carl found and sits down by the door frame. She says, "Mike, I miss you," and starts sobbing, but then she says she missed him even when she was with him. She continues to think about the camp and the loss of her son. She explains that Mike is not to blame for anything, and he could have been alive if things had gone differently. Then she says that she knows the answer to her problems, which is to let people into her life, not to shut them out. The next morning, Rick tells Carl that he shouldn't have risked going alone, but Carl assures him that he was careful. Rick congratulates Carl on finding more food and supplies. Then Carl says he ate some of the food. When Rick asks what it was, Carl replies that it was 112 ounces of pudding, which they laugh at. Rick explains that he understands that they will never be able to put everything back in its place. He explains that he took the time to become a farmer and create a community just for the sake of Carl and Judith. He then tells his son that he is now a man and that he is sorry that he treated him like a child, to which Carl objects and makes it clear that Rick was right to do what he did. Continuing to search for Rick and Carl, Michonne discovers a can of pudding that Carl ate, discarded on the street in front of their house. When she goes up to the porch, she sees them together through the window. She begins to cry with joy, and then looks up, as if thanking God. When she knocks on the door, Rick looks through the peephole and starts laughing at the sight of their friend. Then Rick turns to Carl and says, "It's for you." Beth and Daryl are sitting by the campfire. Beth insists that they should not be the only survivors of the incident in prison. Daryl doesn't answer, and Beth yells at him. She suggests that since he is a tracker, they should track down the others. Then she goes alone into the forest. Daryl puts out the fire and slowly follows her. Later that day, Daryl finds a couple of footprints. Beth hastily assumes they belong to Luke or Molly. Daryl says that even if she's right, it doesn't mean that any of them are alive now. Beth, clearly disappointed by Daryl's disbelief, insists otherwise. As they leave, the camera turns to a log littered with bloody dismembered rabbit carcasses. Daryl and Beth find a bloody spot near the railroad tracks, where they are attacked by Christopher's revived father. Beth notices Cluck's shoe next to a pile of fresh human remains and bursts into sobs. Daryl begins to walk away, seemingly oblivious to Beth's grief. But then he stops and looks around with pity. Lizzie and Micah are walking through the woods behind Tyrese. When they stop to ask a question, Tyrese turns around, holding baby Judith in her arms. At nightfall, they find a clearing and decide to rest. Tyrese feeds Judith, and Lizzie sits on a nearby log, where two rabbits live. She takes out a knife and kills both of them. Suddenly they hear walkers in the distance. It seems that they are getting closer, which forces Tyrese and the girls to flee. The next morning, the girls find a vine and start picking the fruit. While Tyrese is changing Judith's diaper, Mika gets scared by the noise in the bushes and runs away. Tyrese and Lizzie give chase and a few minutes later finds Mika hiding behind a tree. While the group gathers their thoughts, they hear screams in the distance. Tyrese directs the girls back to back, tells them to keep an eye on Judith, and he says he has to investigate. If walkers appear, they should start running towards him. Tyrese stumbles upon an attack by walkers at the railway tracks. Two men, Christopher and his father, are fighting off a group of walkers. Tyrese comes to the rescue, but cannot prevent their death. Then he hears gunshots in the nearby forest. Several walkers approach Nika and Lisa. Nika screams to get her sister's attention, but Lisa is terribly focused and doesn't notice anything. She stares at Judith and presses her hand to Judith's nose and mercury to calm her down. When Tyrese starts coming back for the girls, the three of them and Carol come out of the bushes. Before his death, Christopher's father tells Tyrese about the shelter located up the rails. Maggie, Bob and Sasha are in the woods near the quarry. Maggie sharpens a knife on a rock, and Sasha bandages Bob's hand. Sasha tells Maggie that they should camp there for the night. Maggie agrees that Bob and Sasha should stay there, but declares that she is going to go in search of Glenn herself. Sasha insists that they stay together, but Maggie is defiant, saying that she has already made her choice. She starts to leave, and Bob and Sasha follow her. The three of them stumble upon a prison bus. It turns out that the refugees from the prison did not survive the evacuation. They died and came to life after being hit and killed by bullets that hit the bus, which caused a mini explosion inside the bus. Maggie tells the others that she has to check if Glenn is inside. After Bob says they will do it together, Sasha reluctantly agrees and opens the emergency exit to release the walkers one by one so they can be easily put to sleep. Eventually, the walkers overcome control with Sasha over the door and break out. When the walkers attack, Bob and Sasha defend themselves, and Maggie is petrified. However, Maggie becomes enraged, starts killing walkers, even smashes a female walker's head on a bus, and then stabs her. Then Maggie gets on the bus to check if Glenn is there, and after killing a zombie teenager who is stuck under a dead woman, sits down and starts crying with relief. Glenn wakes up in a section of a ruined prison passageway, almost hanging over a crowd of walkers, several of whom prison inmates killed during the attack. It looks like he got off the bus to look for Maggie before he left and was on the footpath when a tank shot at him, knocking him down. He shouts to Maggie and looks for her. He collects some supplies and clothes, including a bottle of Bob's brandy. After that, he makes his way through the walkers, dressed in riot gear. When he gets out, he sees Tara, who has locked herself in a small fenced place. Glenn stabs a walker who reaches for her before going inside. He quickly takes her weapon, checks the cartridges and sees that she did not shoot during the siege. He tells Tara that it's time for them to leave. After Tara refuses him, he asks her, "Will you just stay here and just die?" Tara replies that she joined the attack on the prison, and Glenn replies that he knows and asks her for help. Glenn grabs a bottle of Bob's brandy and uses it as a Molotov cocktail, which he throws into a nearby car. While the walkers are attracted by the flames, Glenn and Tara escape from the prison and get to the road next to the prison bus. On the way, Tara remembers that she witnessed the events related to the death of her sister during the storming of the prison. She tells Glenn that she shouldn't have been there and that he killed the old man. Glenn asks if it was Herschel, and Tara replies, "I'm sorry." And she tells him that the governor told her that they were bad people, and she understands that this is not true. Glenn tells her that he needs to find Maggie, and Tara asks if she got there. Glenn replies that he doesn't know and tells her that Herschel was a great man who taught Glenn to believe. Glenn uses this as a reason to believe that Maggie is alive. After being attacked by a small group of walkers, Glenn falls, leaving Tara to kill the walker alone. She looks up and sees a military truck shouting that they liked the show. 3 people get out of it: Abraham, Eugene and Rosita. Tara sits in the back of Abraham's military truck and writes the name of the streets on her hand as the truck drives past them. They stop at the wreckage of the car. 3 walkers nearby start hitting the back of the truck. Tara is about to shoot them with a rifle when Abraham orders her to stop. He keeps attacking them with a crowbar, one by one, until they all fall down. Tara notices this and tells him that she sees him smiling for the first time. He replies that it's because I'm the luckiest guy in the world. Michonne and Carl sit down for breakfast over a bowl of cereal. When Michonne says that she would like to drink soy milk, Carl replies that it is disgusting and that he would rather drink Judith's mixture. Reminding himself of the unknown fate of his sister, he abruptly leaves the table. Michonne tells Rick that they are going to go for supplies. Rick offers his services, but Michonne tells him that he needs to rest. Rick gives Carl his Colt and gives him and Michonne until noon to get back. Then Rick goes upstairs and falls asleep on the bed. After they have cleared the first house, Michonne tries to cheer Carl up by eating a huge amount of crazy cheese and pretending to be a walker. When Carl fails to make her laugh, she says that she is good at making babies laugh. This prompts Carl to ask when she was around the babies. Michonne replies that she had a child before the apocalypse, which surprises Carl. Rick wakes up from sleep after hearing the noise of people on the lower level of the house. Hearing approaching footsteps coming up the stairs, he dives under the bed, finding a bottle of water and a book there. A survivor named Tony sits down on the bed, circling it several times, and soon falls asleep. Michonne and Carl continue to clear the house. Carl convinces Michonne to tell him that her baby's name was Andre Anthony. Michonne finds a children's room, inside which is the entire deceased family. Shocked, Michonne slams the door, sees Carl standing outside, and lies to him that there was a dead animal inside. Carl seems to see through the lie, but does not insist on his own, and they stand together in the room. Maybe Andrew Judith is somewhere together, says Carl Michonne. Len enters the room with Rick, who is still hiding under the bed. After an argument about who will sleep on the bed, Len throws Tony off the bed by force, and a fight begins. At some point, Tony closes Rick's eyes, and Len strangles him, and he loses consciousness before he can say anything. The second survivor, satisfied, leaves his friend on the floor and goes to sleep on the bed. Glenn wakes up in the back of Abraham's truck and Tara tells him about the situation. Abraham refuses to stop the truck until Glenn starts pounding furiously on the back window. Glenn tries to leave, but Abraham tells him that he is interfering with the mission. After Glenn asks about the mission, Abraham informs that Eugene knows exactly what caused the apocalypse to begin and that government officials should meet with him in Washington. Glenn tries to leave anyway, and after Abraham tries to get him to stay, Glenn punches him. Abraham jumps on Glenn and they fight. Meanwhile, Eugene sees the walkers approaching and takes it upon himself to try to kill them. Due to poor aiming and poor gun control, he scatters bullets, some of which burst the fuel tank of the truck. Abraham and the others kill the walkers, and Glenn goes old to the bus. Abraham, after a moment's hesitation, follows them. While Len is sleeping, or else not out, Rick leaves the room and tries to leave the house, but Lou notices him. After a short, brutal fight, Rick strangles Lou to death and takes possession of his submachine gun, leaving the bathroom door slightly ajar, presumably so that his revived corpse could attack the others. Then he gets out through the window and walks along the edge of the house. He sees the leader of the group, Joe, sitting on the porch, and is about to kill him when he hears the screams of Harley inside, who is attacked by a revived Lou. When Joe runs inside to help, Rick sees Michonne and Carl coming back from a run. He runs to them and directs them away from the house. As they walk, Carl offers Michonne some crazy cheese, and she laughs, and Rick gives them a puzzled look. They are walking along the railway tracks and notice a sign. After a short discussion, the trio decides to go where the sign points. The sign says, "Shelter for all, those who stay, survive. Terminus."